All right, so Rebecca Parson is an open Democratic Socialist candidate for Washington's 6th Congressional District in the upcoming 2022 midterm elections, and she recently did an interview with Fox News' Jesse Walters where he tried to do this whole gotcha thing on one of the recent advertisements that she put out, basically calling for somewhat of a decommodification of housing here in the United States. So it's a 6-minute interview here, a little bit longer than usual, but I wanted to just watch through and react to this entire thing, because even though Jesse Walters is setting up this interview, as you're about to see, to try to portray Rebecca as if she is the crazy one here, he basically has no substantive responses to any of the actual policy issues that she's bringing up in this interview. So let's go ahead and watch this, and I will commentate my way through it.
Campaign ads keep getting more and more creative every year, and this year's no different. Democratic Socialist congressional candidate Rebecca Parson is running in Washington's 6th Congressional District, and she recently made waves with this in-your-face ad. Take a look.
Billionaires tell us you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Well, that. Imagine I proposed a housing for all bill in Congress. Then imagine you, me, and a million of our friends took action and occupied empty houses nationwide. They couldn't ignore us. No one has ever done anything like this. That's why it's going to work. Are you ready?
Parsons.
Okay, so clearly he's trying to portray that advertisement right here as a setup, as if she's some crazy leftist radical revolutionary socialist who's going to invade your home and take it over with a bunch of other homeless people or something like that. They're trying to misportray it here, but honestly what she's talking about there is something that you would think that the so-called anti-elitist Fox News personalities would be wanting to get behind. And even that initial quote that she put in her ad is actually a quote from one of the recent meetings at the World Economic Forum, which is the center of a lot of conspiracies that conservatives like to focus in on. And she was saying that billionaires and wealthy people who were discussing their plans for the future at the World Economic Forum, they basically came out and said, in the future, you are going to own nothing and you are going to be happy. Now, conservatives use that quote basically to justify believing in a one world government communist entity that is going to take over the world. But really, I mean, it was just, a capitalist talking point where they're further entrenching the power that capitalists have under our global economic model that we have in place right now. And so you would think that using that quote or something would be something that would be appealing to conservatives, especially conspiracy-laden conservatives that like to watch shows like this, but nonetheless trying to set up this entire interview as if she's absolutely wild for suggesting that we do some sort of a mass demonstration or protest while simultaneously introducing a housing for all bill in Congress. That to me sounds like an absolutely great idea that I would 100% support, but they continue here.
Says she's actually occupied empty buildings before, like houses going into foreclosure, and she's instructed homeless people to occupy businesses too, like the Fife Motel in 2020, where they refused to leave or pay after the first night. Some of her other plans she wants to enact if she's elected are to raise the minimum wage to $30 an hour, abolish ICE, because the current immigration system is, quote, a combination of systemic racism, the prison industrial complex, and corporate greed.
All of that is 100% true. I mean, what do you want to call for-profit ICE prison centers where they are literally profiting off of locking people up in these jails? I mean, yeah, that is a perfect example of the most grotesque form of corporate greed you could possibly imagine. Now, on the raise the minimum wage to $30 an hour, you might look at that and say, wow, that's radical, that's impossible, how could we ever do that? She's going to explain a little bit further into this interview, but I don't think that anybody should be terrified of something like that. If you actually go and you look back at Joe Biden's $15 minimum wage plan that he was trying to put forward, putting that in air quotes because they inevitably let it get tanked by a Senate parliamentarian who has no legitimate power whatsoever. But even that $15 minimum wage program that Biden was trying to get passed would have only taken us up to $15 minimum wage by 2025, so 5 years out. So I could definitely see a feasible program where you have the combination of an extension of the period where it slowly raises over time, and then you combine that with even potential state level or federal subsidization of wages for small businesses, for example, that are not actually able to afford a $30 minimum wage. But even just at a fundamental point here, if a business is not capable of paying their workers living wages, then they're not really a business. I mean, they're effectively just an exploitation racket. So again, we're going to hear a little bit more on that front in a second here from Rebecca.
She also wants to repeal federal laws that stop unlawful entry and re-entry of migrants, end cash bail, have a one-time cancellation of all student debt, and pass the Green New Deal. Let's bring in the Democratic Socialist candidate for Congress, Rebecca Parson. All right, Rebecca, so any house, any structure, any building, you're saying rise up and occupy it. Doesn't that seem a little dangerous?
Well, I'm not calling on anybody to break the law. I'm just pointing out the fact that there are 600,000 homeless people in this country, 40,000 homeless veterans, and 1 in 5 homeless people are kids. Meanwhile, we have 28 empty homes for every homeless person. So I'm calling on all of us to think about the empty homes that are owned by corporations like BlackRock, like Zillow, like the banks, that are owned by those companies, those large corporations, and not being used for what they're intended for, which is actually housing people.
Okay, so again, she just absolutely eviscerated his disingenuous question there, right? If you go back and watch how he asked that question, he was asking it as if her proposal is to just break into anyone's home around the United States. You know, if they don't happen to be home at that time, you could just waltz on in and make it your own property. And no, she deflects that back to the actual substance of what she's suggesting here, which is maybe we shouldn't allow gigantic banks and corporations and private equity firms to accumulate vast swaths of our housing stock and restricting the supply, further driving up costs for average Americans, and basically just sitting on thousands and thousands of properties across the United States that are not being used for housing. They're being used as part of an investment portfolio for some of the wealthiest entities that exist on the face of the planet. So how is that anything that's unreasonable or radical or crazy? It really just shouldn't be. I mean, again, these are the same corporate entities that, fake populists like Tucker Carlson and other Fox News pundits like to pretend that they are railing against. Meanwhile, he is doing pure corporate propaganda on their behalf right now.
But if a bank owns a house that's foreclosed, someone that wants the house is able to buy it, but they can't buy it if there's a homeless person in there. What happens if they move in and some guy's just sleeping on the floor?
Well, I'm calling on us to think about buildings that have been empty for a while, that are owned by corporations. You're not having a lot of buyers coming looking at them. They're just sitting empty, and there are a lot of houses like that, both in places like here in Washington State and across the country. And so I think that in the richest country on earth, we should not have anybody who's homeless living on this street, especially not 40,000 veterans, especially not 120,000 kids.
Notice how she keeps bringing up the children and the veterans to really smear it in his face and use something that conservatives like to pretend that they care about, like veterans issues and veteran homelessness, veterans healthcare, etc., and just throwing that back in his face and basically allowing him to side with the corporations over homeless veterans in this instance. So absolutely love to see that perfect rhetoric on that front.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if that's the right way to go about the homeless issue. What about...
Okay, but what is your solution to go about addressing the homeless issue? They don't have any suggestions whatsoever. They don't want to build more public housing. Basically, all they want to do is increase and expand the police state and, either criminalize and arrest homeless people or just push them out of view so that he and his wealthy neighborhoods with the rest of his Fox News buddies just don't have to see homeless people. They don't have any actual substantive plan whatsoever for addressing the issue of homelessness. So completely ridiculous response there.
ICE. You want to abolish ICE? Who's going to deport all the criminal illegal aliens?
Well, actually, decades ago, even during the Reagan era, this was before ICE, and we managed the immigration system fine. I think there's existing, pre-ICE law enforcement that can deal with immigration, but at the same time...
Wait, what do you mean? Who would that be?
Well, for example,
Okay. Who would that be? Customs and Border Patrol, other police agencies. I mean, what are you talking about? ICE as an agency, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, that's younger than me, okay? I'm only 22 years old. It was started under the Bush administration. This is not some, long-standing institution, okay? You can go back, as she was just saying, under the Reagan administration, did the United States have an open border policy? Did we have, illegal immigrants that were just flooding into the country at record pace? No, we didn't have any of that. You can still do what you want to do and enforce the border, and I'm sure that there's there's, much more disagreements they could get into there on their border policy questions. But, his suggestion that it's just going to be like complete lawlessness and chaos and, no sort of system for handling immigration if we got rid of ICE, just completely ridiculous. This is a brand new institution that was started, again, under the Bush administration to further crack down on immigrant populations. And again, notice the rhetoric that he uses there, pretending as if immigrants have higher rates of violent crimes or crime in general than native-born Americans. All of the data that we know is directly contradictory to that, and native-born Americans are much more likely to commit crimes than immigrants who are coming into the country are. So, again, completely disingenuous framing there.
Customs, local police, Customs and Border Patrol. There's also
but
the
local
legal
police
right to
can't
seek
handle
asylum.
immigration law. You need ICE because you got to get these people out of the country that are dangerous, right?
We managed fine before ICE, and what I'm really concerned about is the fact that all across the country, including in my district, there are 28 homes, empty homes for every homeless person. Why do we have veterans sleeping on the street who went to serve their country, and now they can't even find a place to live? And so I'm asking people to think about this situation, this problem we have. Politicians just pay lip service to it. They say they're going to do something about it, and they don't. They act like the problem is way too complicated to solve. Meanwhile, it just gets worse and worse and worse. We actually in Tacoma had people who were encamped on the site of an encampment from the Great Depression 100 years ago. Then it was called a Hooverville. Now it's called a tent city. So if in 100 years we couldn't solve this problem and it's only gotten worse, we need to take a different way of looking at this issue. We need to look at all these empty homes, have people live in them.
I agree the politicians have paid lip service to dealing with the homeless. I just don't know if migrating into abandoned buildings is the best way. You also wanted to raise the minimum wage to $30 an hour. Do you think that might help with inflation?
What? What is the correlation between raising wages to living wages and inflation? She's going to point this out here in a second, but all of the evidence that we have indicates that the vast disproportionate amount of inflation that we have been seeing has been coming directly from corporate price gouging, okay? Corporations who are using and abusing the narrative of inflation in order to artificially drive up their prices for average Americans, average consumers, and they're walking out the back door with record levels of profits, billions of dollars in profits in the case of, for example, fossil fuel companies right now that are weaponizing this moment to artificially raise gas prices, okay? That's the situation. There's no reason to believe that inflation is going to, dramatically spiral us into the abyss if people are given living wages. Just a completely ridiculous way of asking this question, basically.
Well, actually, some studies have found that 60% of inflation is due to corporate price gouging. And with the $30 minimum wage, I realize that's much higher than it is right now. But if you look at the MIT living wage calculator, all across the country, not just in blue states, high-cost blue states like Washington, all across the country, counties in Michigan, Arkansas, Mississippi, $30 is the minimum living wage for an adult to be able to support a child. And if we restructured the way we do incentives with the government, for example, the government has given over $4 billion in subsidies to Elon Musk, but when was the last time they gave a subsidy to a small business owner? I'm a small business owner myself, and if we had the government subsidizing small business owners to pay their employees a living wage, that would go a long way.
Do you pay $30 an hour?
I do, yeah.
You do?
I love how he thought that he was going to get a gotcha question there, and she just immediately responds with, yeah, I do actually pay my workers $30 an hour.
Now, do you know that if other people pay $30 an hour for minimum wage, they might not have a business after that? But that might be what you want, because then they can go out of business and then the homeless people can move into the old building. Listen.
Absolutely not.
All right,
no.
Rebecca, I got to go. This has been enlightening. I think we would agree to disagree. But
okay, I mean, listen, he kind of just pretended throughout that entire interview that he was acting in good faith when he just very clearly was not. I think he thought that she was a lot dumber than she actually is, and he wasn't anticipating that she was going to give substantive responses to his questions. And, what did he have as a rebuttal there to any of the points that she was making? He was just relying on the fact that his audience at Fox News is going to intuitively go into watching an interview like this thinking that she's a radical, crazy, scary Marxist type of candidate, right? So that's entirely what that interview interview was. He didn't have any substantive responses to the problem of homeless veterans and children and other just random citizens here in the United States. Didn't have a substantive response to the living wage problem that we have here in the United States, where a $7.25 minimum wage hasn't been raised in over a decade now. There's literally no place in the entire country where somebody who is making that amount of minimum wage is able to afford even just like 1 or 2 bedroom apartments for themselves and their families. It's completely impossible. So at a fundamental level, even if you are a capitalist, right, what would the free market situation response to this actually be under a true free market? Well, businesses who are not able to provide workers with living wages, they would go under. That's not a viable business. You're just exploiting people by underpaying them for the value of their labor. Okay, so it's a completely ridiculous rebuttal there, but he didn't have anything substantive to say on the living wage issue, didn't have anything substantive to say on the actual strategy of confronting some of the largest corporations in the world who are, restricting the supply of housing in this country, sitting on properties that are vacant for years and years and years. And that mind-blowing statistic that she kept bringing up throughout that entire interview about a, 28 or 20 to 1 ratio of homeless people to unhoused or to unoccupied houses here in the United States. How can you think that that's an acceptable situation? That is a pure embodiment of the problem of having a commodified housing system. Okay, if you have houses that are vacant, of course people should be able to just go live in them, regardless of if they're able to afford the asking price from BlackRock or whatever the corporation may be. So, I think she low-key kind of killed it in that interview and made that Fox News host look like a complete dumbass who didn't really have any response for somebody who he would consider to be, a fringe lunatic on the left.